Hey there. Before we step into tonight's journey, I want you to do something simple. Look at the clock. What time is it right now in your zone? Midnight? 2 in the morning? Or maybe it's just barely creeping past 11 and you've already told yourself just one more video before bed. Good. Because what we're about to dive into is not the kind of story you want to hear in daylight. It's the kind of story that belongs to shadows, to candlelight, to the strange hours when the house is too quiet and every creak in the floorboards feels like a warning. Tonight, we're not going back to medieval Europe with its lice and pottage. No, we're going much, much further back to the banks of the Nile, into the temples of the gods, and into the tombs where the dead were carved open like textbooks. We're exploring the disturbing medicine of ancient Egypt, and I promise you whatever image you've got in your head right now, the white robes, the golden masks, the mystical wisdom of the ancients, forget it. The reality was darker, brutal, grotesque, treatments that involved dung, poison, insects, mutilation, even corpses. Physicians who were half priests, half sorcerers, their cures as likely to kill you as save you. You're going to see medicine not as mercy, but as ritualized terror, a theater of pain written in fire, blood, and smoke. So dim your lights, settle in, and if you're brave enough, leave me a comment telling me exactly what time it is where you are right now. Because while you're reading this, safe, warm, comfortable, somewhere in your imagination, you're about to wake up in a clay-walled chamber in Thebes, a priest leaning over you with a bronze knife, chanting spells and pressing crocodile dung into your wound. And trust me, after tonight's story, you'll never think of ancient wisdom the same way again. The priest as physician, the tomb as hospital, one step into the Egypt of 1500 BCE. The Nile flows with life, yet death stalks every shadow. Here, medicine is not separated from religion. It is religion, fused into a worldview where the gods dictated health and sickness, and every cough, wound, or nightmare was a message from beyond. The physicians of this land, known as Swan W., were not men in white coats, but priest-doctors cloaked in incense and ritual, their offices not clean hospitals, but dim, torch-lit temples echoing with chants to Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague. They carried scrolls, the famous Ebers Papyrus, 110 pages of recipes for treating everything from migraines to crocodile bites. And yet these recipes read less like science and more like grim witchcraft. If you had an infection in your eye, you might find it smeared with honey, which to our modern horror actually had antimicrobial properties. But it was rarely just honey alone. It could be mixed with crocodile dung or the milk of a woman who had given birth to a boy, because the gender of a child supposedly carried healing power. Imagine your eyelids swollen, red, burning, and a priest presses fetid reptile excrement into the wound while chanting spells, believing the filth itself had divine potency. Some historians speculate that infections worsened, blindness spread, but still, the rituals continued because disease was not seen as bacteria. It was seen as a curse, a demon inside you, something only gods could extract. And the doctors themselves were feared as much as revered. One misstep in your treatment, one mispronounced incantation, and it wasn't just your health at stake, but your soul. These physicians believed illness could seep from the underworld, meaning to cure you, they had to negotiate with spirits. This wasn't medicine as we know it. It was a terrifying hybrid of pharmacy, surgery, and sorcery, where every cure hovered on the edge of poison and where patients lived as experiments in a grand spiritual laboratory overseen by gods with claws and fangs, knives, bones, and the theater of pain. Now, let's peel back the bandages, literally, and look at the darker side of Egyptian surgery, because for all their reliance on spells, these people were not strangers to the knife. In fact, they were pioneers of practical surgery, and that should scare you more than it comforts you. Archaeological evidence shows trepanation. The drilling of holes in skulls was performed in the desert sands long before Greek or Roman doctors refined the art. Picture the scene. A man writhes with seizures, perhaps from epilepsy or a head wound, and the priest surgeon decides the only way to cure him is to carve a hole into his skull to let the evil spirits escape. No anesthesia, no sterile field, no morphine drip, just bronze knives sharpened on stone, the patient pinned by relatives, his screams muffled by chants. Some skulls show signs of healing, meaning a few actually survived this ordeal, but most, their final sight may have been a torch flickering over a priest's blood-stained hands, and wounds. They stitched them with linen soaked in beer and copper salts, a crude attempt at antiseptic that sometimes worked, sometimes killed. For broken bones, splints of reeds were bound tight with cloth, but if infection set in, they often resorted to amputation, hacking away with saws designed for wood rather than flesh. And what about dentistry? The Egyptians were some of the first to recognize cavities, but their solution was just as brutal, drilling directly into the tooth with bow drills, then stuffing the hole with a paste of crushed beans, incense, and malachite powder. The agony is unimaginable. Tooth decay was rampant because their bread was ground with stone tools, filling it with grit that shredded enamel over a lifetime. By age 30, most had teeth cracked, rotting and infected, and an abscess could swell into a fatal fever. Imagine the smell of an Egyptian sick room, the stench of gangrene, the metallic tang of copper salts, the smoke of burning incense meant to banish evil spirits, but instead thickening the air with choking haze. Medicine in Egypt was brilliant for its time, but horrifying in practice. A theater of pain where you were as likely to meet Osiris in death as to walk away healed. Parasites, potions, and the poison of the Nile. If you thought surgery sounded like a nightmare, let's wade into something even more sinister, the pharmacy of ancient Egypt, where cures and curses were brewed in the same clay jar. Every remedy was an experiment in desperation, and many of them, by modern eyes, look more like slow poisons than medicines. Start with parasites. The Nile, magnificent as it was, doubled as a delivery system for worms and flukes that burrowed into the intestines, bladder, even the liver. Archaeological studies of mummies show that over 70% of ancient Egyptians carried schistosomiasis, a parasite that causes bloody urine, chronic pain, and organ failure. How did they treat it? With concoctions so bizarre they sound like parodies, ground ostrich eggs mixed into wine, or warm enemas infused with crushed dates and sycamore milk. But the darker side is what we might call pharmaceutical roulette, the use of outright toxic ingredients. The Ebers Papyrus prescribes lead-based ointments, arsenic powders, and mercury-laden pastes for skin diseases, scalp infections, and ulcers. Imagine a priest smearing gleaming green malachite paste on your lesions, chanting as your skin blistered beneath the heavy metals. Did it kill the microbes? Perhaps. Did it kill the patient faster? Often. Yet people returned to these treatments again and again because the alternative was worse, no treatment at all. For contraception, women were instructed to insert pessaries of crocodile dung mixed with honey and sour milk into their vaginas, a repulsive barrier that may have had some acidity against sperm, but carried catastrophic risks of infection. Meanwhile, Fevers were treated with potions brewed from donkey liver and incense resin, while asthma was countered by inhaling the smoke of burning herbs, sometimes laced with opium or henbane, drugs so powerful that hallucinations and unconsciousness were common side effects. But here's the chilling part. These weren't seen as side effects at all. They were evidence that the medicine was working, proof that the demon inside you was being forced out by fire, pain, and delirium. To drink from an Egyptian cup was to gamble your body against your gods, swallowing potions that straddled the line between healing and chemical warfare, mummification, and the anatomy of the damned. Now we reach the darkest theater of all, the Egyptian obsession with the body after death and what it reveals about their medicine. Unlike the Greeks or the Chinese, Egyptians rarely dissected the living or dead in the name of science. Their anatomy lessons came through the grim craft of mummification, where every corpse became a textbook, every incision a ritual. Embalmers who were not priests, but low-caste workers viewed with disgust, cut open the dead with flint knives, pulled out organs with bronze hooks, and stuffed cavities with sawdust, resins, and natron salt until the body was dry as parchment. On one level, this gave Egyptians a shocking familiarity with internal organs. They knew the shape of the heart, the curve of the intestines, the fragility of the brain, but instead of seeking medical truths, they spun spiritual dogma. The heart was the seat of thought, the liver a throne of emotions, the brain useless jelly to be scooped out and discarded. Imagine how many lives might have been saved if they had recognized the brain's role in seizures or memory, but their funerary science became a kind of anti-medicine, preserving myths as carefully as they preserved flesh. Even more disturbing is that these practices bled into living treatments. For instance, the same resins used to pack bodies, pine, juniper, frankincense, were prescribed for internal illness, swallowed as tonics, or burned for inhalation. In other words, the Egyptian cure for your fever might be the same substance used to embalm your grandmother. Some scholars even speculate that the embalmers themselves doubled as unofficial surgeons, applying their anatomical knowledge in secret, experimenting with amputations and organ removal on desperate patients. Imagine being a villager with a festering tumor dragged into a torchlit embalming workshop where the tools reek of corpses, and realizing your healer's hands are more accustomed to stuffing the dead than saving the living. Mummification was not just a ritual, it was the silent operating theater of Egypt, where bodies taught lessons, but those lessons were filtered through superstition, creating a medicine as macabre as it was misguided. Childbirth, blood, and the gamble of life. If you were an Egyptian woman, medicine was less a sanctuary and more a loaded dice roll against death. Childbirth was the most terrifying ordeal you could face, and even the wealthiest households could not buy safety. There were midwives, yes, women armed with ritual knowledge, charms, and a handful of herbs, but the delivery room was less hospital and more battlefield. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, details pregnancy tests that sound like dark alchemy. A woman urinates on barley and emmer wheat. If the seeds sprout quickly, she is pregnant. If barley grows, it will be a boy. If wheat grows, a girl. But these same papyri reveal an arsenal of remedies that could just as easily kill as cure. Vaginal suppositories of honey mixed with crocodile dung to prevent conception, or fumigations of crushed herbs and resin smoke forced between the thighs to speed labor. There was no anesthesia, no sterile instruments, no concept of infection. Complications like breech births, hemorrhages, or obstructed labor were death sentences. Archaeological evidence suggests maternal mortality hovered around 25% per pregnancy, a staggering number, meaning every birth was a brush with the afterlife. Infants fared little better. Many were stillborn, many died within days of infection or malnutrition. Some scholars argue that amulets of Tauret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, were less charms of protection and more desperate insurance policies, a silent acknowledgement that medicine had little to offer. Imagine the scene, a mother writhing on mats of reed, incense burning thickly to choke out demons, midwives chanting spells from memory while smearing ointments of rancid oils and ground malachite onto the mother's swollen belly. The cries of labor blend with prayers to Hathor, begging her to spare the child. If the baby lived, it was hailed as divine intervention. If the mother died, it was whispered that the gods demanded a sacrifice. Medicine here was not about healing, it was about managing death, delaying it when possible, and spiritualizing it when inevitable. Plagues, demons, and the medicine of fear. And then came the plagues, waves of sickness that ripped through Egypt with the speed of locusts. The Nile, which sustained life, also betrayed it, carrying bacteria and parasites that turned harvests into funerals. Some scholars believe outbreaks of smallpox and bubonic plague reached the Nile Valley, carried by traders, leaving mummies with pustular scars and skeletal remains marked by epidemic trauma. But to the Egyptians, these were not biological accidents. They were punishments, manifestations of Sekhmet's wrath. The lion-headed goddess was said to unleash plagues on the disobedient, and physicians sometimes doubled as priests, whose job was not to heal, but to appease her with offerings, bloodletting, and ritual sacrifice. Imagine falling ill with fever and boils, only to have a healer whisper that you are cursed, that demons grip your lungs. The cure? A potion of donkey's milk laced with mold, or worse, drinking water laced with powdered amulets, swallowing ground stone, faience, or lead, as though consuming the god's symbols could drive out infection. The terrifying reality is that some of these potions might have induced hallucinations, delirium, or organ damage, meaning the cure was often deadlier than the disease. And what of isolation? The Egyptians sometimes buried the sick alive in makeshift quarantines, sealing them in huts or forcing them to the desert's edge, leaving them as offerings to Sekhmet in hopes the goddess would be satisfied. Records in medical papyri describe the breath of pestilence and the hands of invisible enemies, as though contagion itself were a demon creeping through villages at night. Medicine, in these moments, became indistinguishable from exorcism, chanting over boiling pots of herbs, smearing corpses with honey to mask the stench of decay, or burning entire households to cleanse them of invisible spirits. Fear was the dominant prescription. A patient was not just sick, they were guilty, cursed, dangerous, and so Egyptian medicine in times of plague revealed its most chilling truth. It was less about saving lives and more about controlling terror, weaving sickness into theology until the line between healing and execution blurred completely. Torture, justice, and the scalpel of the state. Medicine in ancient Egypt was not always about saving lives. Sometimes it was about controlling them. What we might call justice today was for Egyptians a performance of balance, Ma'at, the cosmic order, and when someone broke that order, punishment could take on medical forms that make our stomachs churn. Prisoners, thieves, and political enemies could be subjected to procedures that blurred the line between doctor and executioner. Imagine a man accused of theft. His punishment to have his nose or ears cut off, not just as mutilation, but as a surgical act carried out by state-sanctioned cutters who used the same bronze scalpels employed in operating rooms. These weren't chaotic street punishments, they were controlled, clinical amputations designed to mark the criminal forever. In fact, the same tools used to amputate a gangrenous limb in a peasant's hut might, the next day, be used to slice the tongue out of a political dissenter. Scars became living documents of the state's authority. And then there's the terrifying overlap with interrogation. Some scholars suggest that medical knowledge of veins, of tendons, of how long a person could survive blood loss was used to prolong suffering without immediate death. A priest surgeon might open a vein not to cure but to weaken, to make the prisoner pliant, their pain a form of confession. Even the embalming chambers, filled with tools of cutting and hooks for organs, may have doubled as theaters of punishment, where the state reminded citizens that the gods themselves sanctioned mutilation as a medicine of order. Think about that. Medicine not as relief, but as discipline, wounds inflicted not to close but to remain as eternal warnings. To live under this system was to know that every healer carried within them not only the power of Sekhmet, but the scalpel of Pharaoh, an authority that could heal your eye infection one day and sever your hand the next, all under the same grim philosophy of balance. Curses, spells, and the eternal medicine of the afterlife. The most disturbing dimension of Egyptian medicine was that it did not end with life. For them, healing and curse extended far into death, making the afterlife itself a kind of eternal hospital ward where the soul was either cured or condemned. Papyrus spells describe medicine not just for wounds of flesh, but for injuries to the spirit, incantations to heal bites inflicted in dreams, rituals to remove serpents of shadow from the veins of the deceased. But curses, oh curses, were their own brand of medicine. A healer could inscribe an enemy's name on a clay figurine, hammer nails into its chest, then bury it in a graveyard. This wasn't superstition alone. It was considered a form of diagnosis by reversal, a way of giving your illness to someone else, of transmitting your fever or tumor into their soul. Imagine going to a physician with a stomachache and seeing him carve the name of your neighbor into a wax doll, chanting as your pain is transferred away. Was the neighbor then afflicted? If they sickened, the spell was declared a success, and death itself required medical protection. The Book of the Dead is filled with spells designed as post-mortem prescriptions, cures for hunger in the afterlife, antidotes for snakebite in the shadow realm, treatments to ensure your heart did not testify against you when weighed by Anubis. Mummification was part of this eternal medicine too. The resins, the wrappings, the amulets slipped between folds of linen were not just for preservation, but for healing the spirit body so it would not decay in eternity. Picture a corpse covered with scarab amulets, inscribed with words like renewed or unbroken, as though the dead body itself were a patient still under treatment. In this worldview, medicine was infinite. It stretched beyond the horizon of breath. Healing was not merely about surviving disease. It was about ensuring that even after death, your body and soul were stitched together with spells, curses, and talismans strong enough to carry you into eternity. But lurking in all this was a chilling thought. If healing could follow you into death, so could suffering. A botched ritual, a missing spell, a curse cast against you, and your afterlife would be one of eternal illness, a sickness that no god would cure. Serpents, venom, and the alchemy of pain. The Egyptian landscape was alive with creatures that could kill with a single strike. Cobras, scorpions, vipers. The desert was an open pharmacy of poison, and the Egyptians knew it. They recorded venomous bites in their papyri, catalogued symptoms in chilling detail: swelling, convulsions, foaming at the mouth, the paralysis that creeps up the body like a shadow swallowing the soul. But here's the nightmare. They didn't just fear venom, they used it. The Ebers Papyrus and the Hearst Papyrus contain recipes that deliberately include the venom of snakes or the crushed bodies of scorpions, ground into pastes for wounds, mixed into tonics for fevers, or even smeared on skin as protective charms. Imagine a child stung by a scorpion, screaming in agony, and the physician arrives with a bowl of medicine made from, yes, more scorpion. He chants as he rubs the paste into the child's skin, believing the poison cancels itself out, a primitive attempt at inoculation. Sometimes it may have worked. Venom proteins can, in rare cases, trigger resistance, but more often it turned a wound into a death sentence. And snakes weren't just medicine, they were symbols of divine terror. The cobra goddess Wadjet was painted on temples as protector, her hood flared in eternal strike. Priests wore snake amulets, carried venom in tiny jars, and some scholars suspect they experimented with microdoses, using venom not only for healing, but for hallucination. Imagine swallowing a draught of diluted cobra venom, your body convulsing, your vision fragmenting into divine nightmares. The priests would say you were seeing the gods, but in truth your nervous system was disintegrating, and if you died, it was no failure. It was explained as Sekhmet's judgment, your illness deemed too great for mortal hands. Worse still, venom was weaponized. Enemies could be cursed by slipping powdered scorpion into their wine, a poison invisible, slow, and agonizing. Archaeologists have uncovered amulets inscribed with serpents coiled around knives, images not of healing, but of ritualistic assassination masquerading as medicine. To be treated in ancient Egypt was to be initiated into a gamble with venom, a philosophy where poison and cure were the same substance, and where the healer's hand could just as easily save you as condemn you to die foaming, paralyzed, eyes wide with terror under the desert moon. Madness, possession, and the shadow in the skull. If you think Egyptian medicine for the body was terrifying, wait until you see how they treated the mind. Mental illness, what we call depression, epilepsy, schizophrenia, was not understood as chemical imbalance or trauma. No, it was seen as possession. If you wept uncontrollably, you were said to be gripped by the hand of a ghost. If you heard voices, they were demons whispering through your ears. Epileptic fits, a serpent spirit writhing in your brain, and the cures were as brutal as the diagnoses. Some involved the burning of foul-smelling herbs, henbane, mandrake, cannabis, whose smoke would fill the lungs until the patient collapsed in delirium. Others involved beating the body, whipping the demon out, while priests screamed incantations. But the most disturbing treatments came from their attempts to pacify madness through ingestion. Patients were forced to drink mixtures of rotten beer, donkey gall, and fermented dates, a concoction that induced violent vomiting and diarrhea, as if purging the body could purge the spirit. Imagine being chained to a reed mat, your head pounding with hallucinations, while priests force bile-laced brews into your mouth, holding your nose until you swallow. The retching, the spasms, the stink of sickness. It wasn't healing, it was torture, dressed as salvation. And yet Egyptians also experimented with psychoactive plants. Blue lotus, opium, hashish. These weren't recreational luxuries. They were tools to drown madness in visions. A mad person might be dosed with a tea that sent them drifting into a dreamlike state, eyes rolled back, drool dripping from their mouth, their consciousness wandering into other worlds. To the priests, this was healing, the demons subdued, the spirit pacified. But the line between treatment and execution was razor thin. If the patient worsened, if their fits became violent, they could be declared incurable and abandoned to die. In extreme cases, families might request a ritual banishment, where the possessed person was dragged to the desert, tied to a stake, and left to the elements, offered to the gods as a living sacrifice. To be mentally ill in ancient Egypt was to live at the mercy of priests who saw your brain not as an organ, but as a battlefield between spirits. You weren't a patient, you were a hostage of invisible forces, your fate decided by rituals that blurred healing with horror. Madness was not treated, it was exorcised, sometimes to the point of death, leaving behind the chilling reality that in ancient Egypt, the mind itself was the most haunted temple of all. Dream temples, nightmares, and the physicians of sleep. In the silence of the desert nights, when the air was still except for the hiss of sand and the distant cry of jackals, the Egyptians believed the veil between worlds thinned. Sleep was not simply rest, it was vulnerability. To sleep was to abandon your body to wandering spirits, to let your K, your life force, drift into landscapes stalked by gods, demons, and ancestral shades. And here's the horrifying twist. Medicine followed you into that darkness. Egypt was dotted with dream temples, sanctuaries where the sick and desperate lay on stone floors, smeared with oils, waiting for visions that might cure or curse them. Imagine entering one of these temples of Imhotep, the god-physician, lying on a reed mat beneath towering columns covered in hieroglyphs that glowed in torchlight, and praying that the god would step into your dream. But the rituals to induce these visions were brutal. Priests administered soporific brews, concoctions laced with mandrake root, opium resin scraped from poppies, fermented beer thick with mold spores, all designed to pull you into a hallucinatory sleep. The result was not a peaceful dream, but a fevered delirium, a plunge into worlds where serpents crawled from your mouth and lions stood at your bedside. Priests hovered nearby, recording your cries, interpreting your spasms as messages from the gods. If you dreamed of drowning, it meant your lungs were diseased. If you dreamed of fire, it meant your stomach was inflamed. But here's the terrifying reality. Many of these dreams were not divine at all, but the byproduct of poisoning, a nervous system unraveling under alkaloids and toxins. Patients woke trembling, drenched in sweat, unable to separate dream from waking horror. And worse, sometimes they did not wake at all. Overdoses were common. The line between sleep cure and ritual euthanasia was paper thin. Families accepted it because they were told their loved one had been taken by the god, when in truth they were taken by the medicine itself. And the dreams themselves could haunt the living. And when some patients awoke convinced that demons had followed them back, clutching their throats or whispering in their ears. Priests offered more potions, more incantations, more sleepless nights in the temple, trapping people in an endless cycle of visions and cures that blurred into torment. Medicine here was not about rest, it was about plunging into nightmares under the guidance of men who saw no difference between hallucination and healing. The dream temples were less hospitals and more labyrinths of fear, where every night was a gamble. You might wake healed, you might wake haunted, or you might never wake again. Necromancy, corpses, and the medicine of the dead. If the dream temples blurred sleep with medicine, the necromantic healing blurred death itself. For the Egyptians, corpses were not inert. They were reservoirs of power, both sacred and dangerous. Physicians sometimes worked in direct proximity to embalmers, who had carved thousands of bodies open and knew the textures of livers, hearts, intestines. But instead of using this anatomical knowledge to advance surgery, much of it was folded into rituals that now read like horror. The line between healer and necromancer was paper thin. There are scattered references in papyri that suggest physicians used fragments of the dead, powdered bone, ashes of burned mummies, dried blood, as components in remedies. Imagine swallowing a potion made from the charred remains of a corpse, told that it would strengthen your lungs or protect you from demons. And archaeologists have even found jars sealed with resin and human remains that seem to have been stored not for burial, but for use, as though parts of the dead were stockpiled for medical rituals. Corpses were seen as liminal, half in this world and half in the afterlife, making them potent conduits of power. A healer might press a piece of embalmed flesh against a wound, believing it could close the door through which disease entered. They might grind mummy dust into a fine powder and mix it with beer, forcing the patient to drink death itself in hopes of shocking life back into balance. And then there were the more terrifying rites, whispered stories of physicians who invoked the spirits of the recently dead to diagnose the living. Families might bring a sick child to a healer, who instead of examining the body, would conduct a séance in a burial chamber, asking the spirit of a freshly embalmed corpse what curse had fallen upon the child. The answers filtered through the priest's interpretation often demanded offerings, blood sacrifices, or the mutilation of animals. In this way, necromancy and medicine merged until they were indistinguishable. Picture being a villager, brought into a dark chamber reeking of resin and decay, while a physician kneels before a corpse, chanting spells, sprinkling natron, and then declaring that your illness can only be cured by feeding the Nile with a goat's blood, or worse, your own. Healing was not gentle, it was terrifying, a direct negotiation with death. And this mindset bled into afterlife rituals. If you died of disease, priests sometimes placed amulets in your wrappings, specifically to heal you in eternity, as if death itself was just another hospital ward. But here is the most unsettling thought. How many patients died not of disease, but of the treatments, poisoned by corpse dust brews, strangled by rituals, suffocated in tombs turned clinics? For Egyptians, the body was never just a body. It was a battlefield between life, death, and eternity, and the physician stood as both healer and executioner, guided not by science, but by the chilling belief that sometimes the dead themselves held the cure. Beasts, blood, and the sacrificial cure. When the human body faltered in Egypt, healers often turned to the animal kingdom, not merely as sources of food or labor, but as living instruments of medicine. To modernize, their treatments look more like rituals of horror than healing. Sacrifice was not rare, it was prescription. If a fever consumed you, priests might slaughter a bird, collect its warm blood in a clay dish, and smear it across your chest, believing that the life force of the animal would replace what your body had lost. Crocodiles, sacred and feared in equal measure, provided both terror and treatment. Their dung was pressed into poultices, their fat boiled into unguents, their teeth ground into powder and swallowed as remedies against back pain or fever. To treat snakebite, one might actually drink a mixture of the snake's own flesh and honey, under the belief that consuming the beast conquered its venom. Imagine the taste of rotting reptile meat sliding down your throat while priests chant, your tongue blistering from the toxins, and you praying that the gods accepted this gruesome offering as medicine. And then there were live animals used as instruments of healing. Lice, beetles, even flies were sometimes placed deliberately onto wounds, because Egyptians believed they drew out evil. What we see as infestation, they saw as exorcism. Maggots, ironically, could sometimes clean rotting flesh, but more often they burrowed too deep, turning wounds into gaping pits. Some texts describe priests binding a live pigeon to a tumor, waiting until the bird suffocated and died, then declaring the illness transferred into its body. Other cures demanded eating organs raw, the liver of a bull for strength, the heart of a gazelle to calm madness. In every case, the idea was the same. The boundary between human and animal could be crossed through blood, through ingestion, through sacrifice. But what if the sacrifice failed? What if the fever did not break, or the wound still festered? The blame was never placed on the physician, it was placed on the patient. Clearly they had angered a god, or hidden a sin, or carried a demon too powerful for mortal medicine. In these cases, the cure escalated. A larger animal might be slaughtered, perhaps a goat or even a bull, its entrails spread open before the sickbed as priests read omens in the steaming coils of flesh. If the omen was bad, the patient might be abandoned entirely, left to rot with amulets tied around their neck as a final gesture. To be ill in Egypt was to live at the mercy of animals, their bodies broken and bled for your sake, their spirits invoked as unwilling companions in your suffering. Medicine was not simply about herbs and chants, it was about dragging beasts into your nightmare, sacrificing them to prop up your fragile body, as though survival itself required turning the desert into an abattoir of cures. Insects, infestations, and the medicine of decay. But animals were not the only creatures pressed into service. The Egyptians also turned to the crawling, buzzing, writhing world of insects, a choice that reveals just how desperate and disturbing their medicine could become. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs infested nearly every household, and rather than seeing them as pests, physicians sometimes interpreted them as tools of divine healing. Some papyri prescribe crushing fleas into pastes for skin conditions, or using lice boiled in oil as remedies for baldness. Imagine the horror, a healer rubbing a greasy ointment of insect carcasses onto your scalp, assuring you it will bring back your hair, while the stench of burnt bug flesh fills your nostrils. Flies were even worse, because they bred in filth. Egyptians believed they carried unique spiritual power. They collected dead flies from dung heaps, ground them into powder, and sprinkled them over wounds, thinking it would repel infection. In reality, it did the opposite. Open sores swarmed with more insects, laying eggs, turning human flesh into breeding grounds. Maggots wriggled into necrotic tissue, sometimes buying a little time, sometimes eating the patient alive. But the most grotesque practice involved scarab beetles. Sacred to the sun god Ra, they were believed to embody rebirth, rolling their dung balls like miniature suns across the desert. And physicians turned this symbolism into cure. Powdered scarabs were drunk in wine to renew the body, or pressed into poultices to treat ulcers. Patients were told they were ingesting the essence of resurrection, but in truth, they were swallowing shards of insect shell that shredded their intestines. Other remedies instructed patients to sleep with jars of live beetles at their bedside, hoping their energy would crawl into the patient during the night. Imagine lying feverish, sweating, while a clay jar at your feet vibrates with scratching, clicking, the ceaseless scrape of insect legs, desperate to escape. This was not metaphor, it was literal medicine. Worse still, infestations themselves were sometimes blamed on the patient. If flies gathered around you, it meant a curse was feeding on your flesh. If lice multiplied in your hair, demons had nested in your skull. The cure? More insects. Potions brewed with honey, milk, and crushed beetles, smeared onto your body until you reeked of rot. Insects were not only medicine, they were punishment, a living reminder that sickness meant corruption, and corruption attracted the crawling multitudes. In this way, Egyptian medicine revealed its most horrifying truth, that healing and decay were inseparable, that survival required embracing filth, and that the buzzing of flies around your wounds was not a sign of death, but of treatment. Fire, smoke, and the burnt offering of flesh. Among the most terrifying practices in the medical arsenal of ancient Egypt was the deliberate use of fire. To them, fire was not merely destructive, it was purifying, divine, a force that could consume demons and disease alike. Physicians wielded flame as if it were both scalpel and exorcist, searing sickness out of bodies in ways that make modern cauterization look merciful. Imagine a festering wound on your arm, crawling with infection. Today, we would clean and disinfect it. But in Egypt, a priest-physician might hold a bronze rod over a brazier until it glowed red, then press it directly into your flesh, cauterizing the wound in a hiss of smoke and blistering agony. The patient's screams filled the chamber, while the healer muttered invocations to Sekhmet, each word blending with the sizzle of burning skin. The idea was simple and terrifying. If demons had entered through the wound, then fire was the god's blade, sealing the gateway. Sometimes it worked. The heat killed bacteria, closed veins, but more often it spread infection deeper, roasted muscle, crippled limbs. Patients who survived carried scars like brands, their bodies marked forever by the medical fire. And fire was not only applied directly, smoke itself was medicine. Physicians burned resins, herbs, dung, even animal fat, forcing patients to inhale acrid fumes until they coughed blood. Asthma, in particular, was treated by inhaling the smoke of burning henbane or frankincense. Imagine sitting in a sealed mud chamber, air thick with poisonous smoke, your lungs seizing as priests chant that the spirits are being driven out. You stumble out half-conscious, eyes streaming, chest aflame, and this was considered healing. For gynecological complaints, smoke was sometimes funneled directly into the womb through hollow reeds, a fumigation ritual meant to cleanse the body. The violation of such a procedure is chilling. Women squatting over smoke pots while priests invoked goddesses, as if the womb itself were an altar that needed exorcism. But fire's darkest role came in ritual medicine tied to sacrifice. When plagues struck, entire animals, goats, oxen, birds were burned alive, their smoke driven over the sick in clouds of reeking black ash. The belief was that disease could be transferred into the animal, and its burning body would carry the sickness away. Now imagine being a fevered child, coughing blood, while priests drag a bleeding goat to the fire, slit its throat, and throw its body into flames, the smoke enveloping you as you gag. To the Egyptians, this was medicine. To us, it was ritualized terror, masquerading as healing. Fire consumed not only animals and bodies, but dignity itself. The body was not treated with compassion, but with flame, as if the gods themselves demanded offerings of charred flesh to permit survival. And the worst part? The more violent the burning, the more convinced the people were that the ritual had power. Fire did not just cauterize wounds, it cauterized hope, binding medicine and torture in a dance of smoke that smothered patients as surely as it cured them. Starvation, purgation, and the cruel cleansing of the body. If fire was one path to purification, starvation and purgation were another, equally cruel. The Egyptians believed illness came from corruption inside the body, rotting humors, malevolent spirits lodged in the gut, poisons in the blood. The cure? Drive them out. no matter the cost. Starvation was sometimes prescribed as medicine. Patients suffering from fevers, skin conditions, or madness might be deliberately denied food, forced to drink only water or bitter herbal brews for days, even weeks. The logic was as brutal as it was simple. Demons fed on sustenance, so starving the patient starved the spirit. Imagine a man racked with seizures, tied to a mat while his family watches him waste away, lips cracked, eyes sunken, priests chanting that the weakness in his body proves the demon is dying. In truth, the patient withers, his organs failing, his strength gone, yet the priests insist this is cure, the visible triumph of their ritual. But starvation was not enough. Purgation was even more popular and more horrifying. Physicians prescribed violent emetics and laxatives, forcing patients to vomit and defecate until their bodies collapsed. Remedies included drinking rancid castor oil, swallowing paste made from ground acacia pods mixed with water, or consuming potions laced with natron, the same desiccating salt used in mummification. Imagine the pain, your throat burning, your stomach convulsing, your intestines torn raw as you writhe in filth. And yet priests hovered, nodding in satisfaction, declaring that the demons were being expelled. In extreme cases, patients were made to swallow melted fat or animal bile, liquids that scalded the throat and poisoned the gut. Many died not of their illness, but of the treatment. But to the Egyptians, this was proof of divine judgment. The gods had chosen not to spare the patient. Even enemas, administered with reed tubes and animal bladders, were a cornerstone of Egyptian medicine, believed to flush out spiritual corruption. Some records suggest daily enemas were recommended, a relentless cleansing ritual. Now picture a fevered patient bent over, while a priest forces animal fat, honey, or herbal mixtures into their bowels, the procedure painful, humiliating, and repeated until the patient collapsed. For Egyptians, this was not cruelty. It was sacred hygiene, a purification ritual practiced for centuries. Kings themselves, including pharaohs, were said to undergo ritual enemas, proving that even the highest ranks submitted to the terror of the reed tube, and the cruelty of purgation reached beyond the body into the spirit. Some priests prescribed fasts of silence, where patients were not only denied food, but forbidden to speak, believed to starve the demons that clung to their tongues. Imagine a woman with migraines, lips sewn shut with strips of linen, forced into silence for days while her body weakened, her voice erased. Medicine here was not gentle. It was annihilation. It reduced the patient to emptiness, to hollow flesh through which gods might pass. But here's the true horror. It was all justified by the promise of purity. To heal in Egypt was to suffer. To be cleansed was to be broken down, emptied, burned, or starved, until nothing remained but a shell for the gods to refill. Starvation and purgation did not save lives. They sanctified suffering, making agony itself the proof of healing. Ritual mutilation and the scalpel of the gods. In the cruelest corners of Egyptian medicine, the body was not treated as sacred flesh, but as a vessel to be carved, marked, and mutilated in the name of healing. When diseases resisted charms, smoke, and starvation, physicians sometimes resorted to ritual cutting, not merely surgery, but disfigurement passed off as cure. Imagine a patient with a tumor swelling from the neck. The priest-surgeon ties him down, whispers incantations to Sekhmet, and then with a bronze blade slices not only the tumor, but whole sections of flesh, gouging away at healthy muscle to ensure no trace of demonic corruption remains. The man survives if he is lucky, but the wound festers, His body is scarred, not just by disease, but by the cure itself, mutilation branded as healing. Amputations, too, were performed not only for gangrene or trauma, but as acts of exorcism. A festering finger was not just a wound, it was a doorway for evil spirits. Better to cut it off and burn it, sending the sickness back to the underworld. Sometimes the patient's ears or nose were removed, the disfigurement both treatment and punishment, because visible scars proved that demons had been driven out. In this way, medicine and law blurred. A thief's hand cut off by decree was also a medical procedure, a sanctioned act of healing society's disease through mutilation of the criminal. The surgeon's tools, the knives, hooks, and saws of the embalmer, moved seamlessly between temple, sick room, and execution ground. And some mutilations went even deeper. Texts hint at trepanations, holes drilled into the skull, to release demons of madness or epilepsy. Picture the scene, a man writhing in seizure, held down by family, while a priest drills into his skull with a bow drill used for wood. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, only the belief that a hole in the bone would let spirits fly out. Some skulls show healing, proving a few survived. But imagine the agony, the searing pain, as the drill bites into bone, the sound echoing like thunder inside the head. To live afterward was a miracle, but a miracle wrung out of mutilation. Even circumcision, practiced widely, was framed as medicine. It was a ritual cut, a controlled wound to ensure purity, proof that flesh itself must be scarred to please the gods. Some evidence suggests that clitoridectomy, the removal of female flesh, may also have been practiced in isolated cases, justified as a way to tame women's bodies. Whether widespread or rare, the idea alone chills, that parts of the body could be ritually cut away to control desire, fertility, or fate. In every act of cutting, Egyptian medicine revealed its darker truth. Healing was violence sanctioned by divinity, and the blade was as sacred as any prayer. The gods did not heal with kindness, they healed with scars. The prescription of death. For all its rituals, chants, and remedies, Egyptian medicine carried an unspoken rule. When healing failed, death itself became the cure. To the priests, the boundary between doctor and executioner was porous. If a patient was declared beyond saving, possessed by a demon too strong, cursed by a god too wrathful, their continued presence was dangerous to family and community. The solution was sometimes silent abandonment, sometimes deliberate hastening of death. Imagine being a fevered man brought to a healer. After weeks of potions, fumigations, and mutilations, the priest declares your sickness incurable. You are carried to the desert's edge, left with water and an amulet, your body offered to the sands, vultures circle, jackals wait. To your family, this is not cruelty but piety, an act of giving you back to the gods. Other times, the prescription was more direct. Papyri described mixtures of herbs so toxic they read like recipes for euthanasia, henbane, mandrake, and opium ground, with honey swallowed until the patient drifted into unconsciousness and never returned. To the priest, this was not murder but mercy, sparing the soul further torment, but it was also control, the physician deciding not only how you lived, but how you died. Imagine the final moments. Your throat burns with poison, your vision fragments into darkness, while priests chant over your fading body that you are being healed. Death was the last medicine, and it was administered with the same solemnity as a poultice or a fumigation. And sometimes death was made a spectacle. In times of plague, the incurably sick were isolated, sealed inside huts that were burned with them still alive. their bodies offered as sacrifices to Sekhmet. It was believed that the goddess demanded human lives to end epidemics, that only fire and blood could stop her plague. Picture it. The sick huddled together as flames consume the walls, screams drowned by chanting, the smoke rising like an offering to the lion-headed goddess. Survivors saw this not as atrocity, but as medicine on a cosmic scale, one life or dozens sacrificed to save the many. Even in death, medicine continued. Corpses were treated with amulets and spells to heal the spirit in the afterlife, as though every wound of life must be bandaged before entering eternity. But the chilling implication lingers. How many deaths were declared cures? How many patients were led to their end, not by disease, but by the hand of medicine itself? Egyptian physicians were healers, yes, but they were also gatekeepers to the afterlife, holding in their hands the power to prolong suffering or end it in fire, poison, or abandonment. In the shadow of their temples, healing and killing were the same act, both written in the language of gods. And that's where we'll leave Egypt's medicine for tonight. Strange, isn't it? We tend to look at the past through golden filters, pyramids glowing in the sunset, priests whispering wisdom, the mystery of the Nile stretching out like an eternal promise. But peel away that image, and what you really find is fear. Fear made into ritual, fear carved into skin, fear swallowed in potions of bile and dung, whispered through smoke, etched into bones. Healing was never gentle. It was a gamble, a negotiation with gods who seemed more like predators than protectors. And the most disturbing part? People believed in it. They needed to, because when the choice was between doing nothing and doing something, even if that something was fire against your flesh or scorpions in your medicine, you chose the pain, because pain at least meant hope. Now, take a second, glance at the time again. What hour is it where you are? Did you make it through this whole descent into darkness while the clock ticked past midnight? Did the room feel colder as you read about fumigations, mutilations, corpses ground into powder? If it did, let me know down in the comments. Tell me where you are in the world, what time it is, and whether you dare to spend even one night in an Egyptian hospital. Personally, I don't think I'd last a single hour. Thank you for staying with me through this shadowed journey. If you made it all the way here, you're braver than most. And if you'd like more stories that dig through the dust, more truths that are darker than the myths, make sure you're subscribed, because the next journey, it's going to be even worse. Until then, sleep well. If you can,